Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today we wanted to start what is largely going to be a kind of a two-part series about, I guess, more the financial business side of being an independent app maker. And specifically, we're going to be talking through viewing your apps in two different, through two different lenses. One we're going to talk about today is kind of viewing your apps as though you're creating annuities that pay you back over time. And then next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about viewing your apps as sort of assets that you are building up for the purposes of selling down the road. And they're just kind of, I think this is one of those topics that is very much outside of the typical like developer-y kind of topics and the kind of things that we would normally, discuss, in the sense that, we're not talking about Xcode, we're not talking about design.
There's going to be a WWDC session about how to sell your business.
Yeah. Like, this is a topic that is very much, this is like a business topic. We could be making anything. The fact that it's an application is in some ways kind of immaterial, but I know for myself, when I started off doing this, I gave no thought to these types of topics at all. I was focused entirely on the development side of things. I was focused on the design side of things and the marketing to some degree. But like thinking of these kind of broader business things wasn't really, something that was on my radar at all. And now, 8.5 years later, it is something that I think about more, and I realize the importance of thinking through, mostly just because depending on what you want your business to look like, how you want it to pay you in both now and in the future, what your ultimate goals are, will impact the types of apps that make sense for you to build. Different apps have very different, revenue curves. If you make a paid upfront app, you're far more likely to have a big burst of revenue at once, and then it will fall off, fairly dramatically. If you have free with ad or free with in-app purchase application, you're more likely to have kind of this slow, hopefully growth of revenue that is fairly stable over time, or at least, shifts in these kind of more seasonal, in these kind of seasonal waves. And depending on what you like there will make a big difference. But, for the purpose of today, what I'm going to talk about to start off with, and this got started for me by, I've been doing a lot of work updating my app audiobooks, which I think I've mentioned a few times the last few episodes. And as part of it, as part of this update is kind of the realization that I haven't done any work on this app really for about 18 months, which is not a good idea, isn't great, but is because other opportunities have presented themselves. I've been doing much more work on the health and fitness side of things recently, and this app that for a while was like my bread and butter, was the thing that was paying, sort of like paying my mortgage each month. It kind of had fallen a bit to the side. But as a result, I got this opportunity to have some really interesting data about, of course I did. I made a spreadsheet. I took a look
just
at
one?
Just one, two or three, it's fine. I don't have a problem. I can stop anytime. I took a look at the revenue of this app over the last 18 months. Because one of the things that I've always been curious about is what happens to an app, when you stop working on it, when you stop maintaining it, when you stop marketing it, when you stop doing anything with it. Like, what does that actually look like? Because in the back of my mind, I've always had this thought of like, sales won't immediately drop to zero. Like, that is, that's just not the reality, because, I go for weeks or months between updates typically. You usually don't, let them go out to 18 months, but you kind of get the sense that over time, sales will likely fall. If they don't, stop working on it. If doing nothing makes your revenue go up, do nothing, that's awesome, but that's not realistic. And so what I did for audiobooks is I took a look over the last 18 months and I looked at what the revenue curve looked like. For this app with no maintenance, no anything. It's just been sitting on the App Store. And the app makes its money from advertising and to a very small degree, some in-app purchases for some kind of premium books. And what was interesting to me is that the curve that the revenue took matched pretty closely to kind of a exponential decay curve, like I said, around with some best fit lines and things. And essentially what it meant is the sales went down by 0.5%, I think it was, per day, sort of compounding. And so, say for argument's sake, the app had been, selling for $100 a day. And then I stopped working on it. Like the next day, it would lose 50 cents in revenue, and the next day, 49.8 cents, and then 49.5 cents, and so on. Like it loses less each day because of there's less from it, and that curve of about 0.5% a day seemed to match fairly closely to it, and which meant that obviously, as it falls down, you start losing less and less, and per day, and it almost sort of starts to stabilize and level out. Obviously, it's still losing as it goes, but it gets slower. And that was really interesting to me because that, like that number and that multiplier is, I'm sure, very variable based on a lot of things. But it's instructive to think about how an app's revenue will sort of almost certainly have that kind of a decay curve, and like the slope of it and the steepness of it will change. But that's a really helpful tool for me as I think about apps, because now I have some data to back up this notion that I've always had, that in many ways, the way business that I like to build is I want to have a steady, even income from my applications that, in an ideal world, requires a relatively small amount of constant maintenance and input. I'm coming from a background where I used to do consulting, where all of my income was, I guess you could call it like prepaid, in the sense that I have a contract with someone that says I'm going to work for them for 80 hours, and they're going to pay me $100 an hour. So they're going to pay me $8,000, and that's the contract, and that's the most I'll ever make from that project. And it's all kind of prepaid. And shifting to a world where everything is postpaid, where I do all this work for nothing, essentially. I release the app, and then hopefully it pays me back over time. And in many ways, that's the same kind of a thing that if in the financial world, which you would call something like an annuity, which is where you take a large sum of money and you give it to a bank or an investment institution, and they pay you an amount of money back each month, that you're shifting the risk for them generating that money onto them, and you're getting a steady stream of income. And like that model for what an application is, I find is really kind of nice, because you get this sense of, my goal is just to build up a broad, diversified pool of these little income streams that each individual one is kind of slowly decaying over time. And my job, is I can increase or reduce the degree to which they're decaying, or in some case, hopefully grow them, by putting in work. But if I want to go on vacation, or if I get distracted or things happen, my income will very slowly decay over time. But in general, we'll keep going, and we'll have a pretty long runway. And I think this was actually before Under the Radar, but back when I remember talking about it on my old show, Developing Perspective, where there was a period of time a couple years ago where I had to take, for a variety of kind of personal reasons, I had to take, I think it was about six or so weeks off of work, basically. And it was lovely that during the course of that, my income didn't fall off dramatically. It wasn't like all of a sudden, if I'd been a consultant, that would have been a really big problem to suddenly just like not have any income. And so instead, like my income fell, and it kind of slowly decayed, but I still had this kind of annuity that was paying me back. And and so I love that. And so what I do now is I think I structure my business around that. That's why I have so many apps. That's why I have so many of these little streams coming in the hopes that kind of building that layer cake that will average out to something that is, somewhat dependable and somewhat reliable.
I love the idea that you're like living off of background noise, like the asymptotic tails of all these curves, and you just like pile enough of them up, and here I have like a background radiation income.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, that's kind of wonderful. I mean, and that's the thing that is kind of nice about it, though, is that it is I think so often in software development, we kind of the thing that you hear most often about is the kind of the big impressive first month of the sales of an app. Or a new update or anything, like where you have, it's easy, and it's not easy, but it is more easy to focus on that big exciting part of it, where like you do a big update and everyone loves it and like sales go up and everything's exciting. But what's more interesting from a more like a lifestyle perspective is what happens 6 months down the road with that, and is there a way to make that make your living on that noise, on that kind of that slow, easy part down below, where you're not having to put in the effort that you did up front, and just obviously you need enough apps for them to decay at a slow enough rate that it still, sums up to a reasonable living. But if you can, or at the very least, if you can get close to that and, be hoping that, you have some big bursts that build up your reserves, and then you have this noise in the middle that you can, live on. It is an approach that seems to have worked a couple times for me, and is something that I think like the math checks out. And that's what I was kind of really excited to have the opportunity to sit down and like really dive into it, with audiobooks, because now I can kind of prove to myself that the experience I've been having of like, this seems to be working, for the last couple of years. Like the math checks out, and it kind of follows a pattern that is somewhat, predictable, or at least reasonable to base a livelihood on.
Yeah, it's funny, like, in other areas of web-based work, things like blogs, the idea of like building up stuff up front that then has a very long tail of revenue over time is not a new idea. Like in the blogging world, you have straight up blog ads and things like affiliate links where you can write a blog post, and then it might get a certain number of views from like the main subscribers, active audience that day or that week. But then over the next 10 years, it could be getting search traffic. And then you can be slowly building up more and more ad money over time from this big back catalog that you have. And for me, like on my site, I never made a ton from the ads, but I actually started in the last few years making a pretty good amount of Amazon affiliate revenue, because over years I have written a pretty good number of product reviews, things like headphone stuff, coffee stuff, the baby stuff guides, and those have slowly built up search relevance over time. And at first when I started out with Amazon links forever ago, like Amazon affiliate links, I would make effectively nothing. It was like maybe like $20 a month for a while, and I stopped looking for a long time because it was so low. I kind of stopped paying attention, and then eventually it became real money. Like it became, after a few years of doing it and slowly building up from like $10-20 a month, it eventually became a few $100s a month. And then now it's like over $1,000 a month. And that's all from stuff I wrote years and years ago, for the most part, not a lot of new stuff, that just over time, it's kind of like where each post is one of these little like decaying asymptotes. Like, like over time, I have enough of these, and it does build up to something substantial. And it's interesting to think of apps this way, because I don't think most of us think of apps that way. I think most of us, the idea of doing, blog posts and links that way, I think we are accustomed to by now. But the idea of doing apps that way almost seems like wrong, or like you're getting away with something, because I think people expect that apps need to be the more high profile launch kind of things, and the have to be constantly maintained over time, and have to constantly be getting updates and new versions and keeping everything fresh and new, while it's totally okay to let a blog post sit there for 10 years unmodified. I wonder, like, is this kind of a temporary thing? Is this always going to be the case? I mean, what the causes might be of why apps can behave this way, or why they might not behave this way? Like we have this coming fall, it's looking increasingly likely that Apple's cutting off support for old 32-bit apps, and that's going to cut off a lot of people's long tails unless they go and update them. But I wonder, like, it seems like this is probably okay for the long haul overall as a model. Like, it seems like this is probably going to keep working, because it turns out that keeping apps up to date, for the most part, really isn't that important for whether or not they will have, a long tail of success.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to, I think there is something there, like it's why the reason why I thought it would be a good topic is because I feel like it also is important to think through the type of applications where an approach like this would actually work. Because the reason this approach works for me is because the types of apps that I am making, by and large, don't have large ongoing costs and expenses and infrastructures that I have to have in the background to support them. I think all the sum total of the infrastructure I have for audiobooks is, I think it's about $100 a year at Linode. I have a little server that serves thumbnails and a few other things, but it's essentially nothing in the scope of the app. And so that allows the fact that the app isn't, it's as its revenue decreases slowly over time, its income, the expenses that I'm having to put out for it, they become a higher proportion perhaps of its income, but they're still so small to start with that it doesn't really matter. Whereas if you had an app for example, for me, Feed Wrangler, and I imagine for you with Overcast to some degree, if you have an app that has a bigger server infrastructure, that is going to be $1,000 or $2,000 a month in server costs, it starts to become trickier to do this type of thing, where that slow that sort of a slow decay will very quickly cross over and then be losing money rather than gaining money, which is essentially what happened for me with Check the Weather, where I had a weather app which I hadn't done updates for in a while too, but I had to eventually kill it off because I was losing money on it, because there was this ongoing cost for weather data providers that wasn't being offset by it. And so I think with software, the key for this to work is the more that you can make the applications that you're building kind of built in such a way that they are more like blog posts, or they are more like YouTube videos. There's lots of things that like you said, this isn't a new concept at all. This is the business model of most kind of media companies, where a media company makes a show they make Seinfeld and they put it in syndication they put it out on broadcast TV, and then they put it into syndication, and then they sell DVDs, and it's exactly the same thing that they're just kind of reselling over time. And the degree to which an app can be that, I think, is it's something that is fairly self-contained, that is built in this way that doesn't require a lot of constant updates and maintenance. And fair enough. Eventually, you'll have to either update it or it will stop working. That is, I think software has a higher barrier for that versus just a plain text file that you're putting on the web, essentially. But it doesn't have this intrinsic need that it has to be updated every few months. And in some ways, that's counterproductive. That, we've talked about many times, the trap of over featuring an application and having the sense that there's this urgency that it always has to be new and better, when in fact, maybe it isn't. And you can just kind of let it go. And as long as you have a customer base that likes the app that you shipped whenever you shipped it, people still use audiobooks that I shipped 18 months ago, and they use it on a regular basis, and it still works. And the updates that I'm doing now are in some ways unnecessary to it. I think it's a good thing in terms of trying to bump up that rate a little bit, and so that it'll sort of start decaying from a higher point again. But if I didn't do anything, my guess is they would just keep going slowly on, until at some point it breaks. And who knows, maybe iOS 11 would introduce something that would force it to be updated, which, fair enough. That's the reason why it was updated 18 months ago, was because that was iOS 9 broke something in it. And so I had to update it, and I did, and I fixed it. And then I haven't done anything since. And those kinds of maintenance updates are so much easier and so much lighter weight than, kind of like the big broad things that you'd have to do if you kind of have a perspective of you're trying to grow, and that's your goal.
Yeah, I mean, it really does kind of impact how you develop everything. I mean, if you're thinking about how can I design this app and build this app in such a way that it will require the least maintenance over time and be the least likely to unexpectedly break in future OS updates or with future changes to the landscape, that affects things. Like, for instance, running off of a Linode server, which actually they're a sponsor this week, which I'll get to in a minute. Running off of a Linode server, that is, to me, more future-proof than running off of a service like Parse or some kind of like managed high-end or higher abstraction layer service, because that landscape of those services changes all the time. And if you write an app today on like a higher level abstracted service, in 3 years, you might have moved on and you're just leaving this app in maintenance mode and hoping it just collects money over time. But then that service might shut down or do some kind of forced change that will break your app. And then you're stuck having to decide either, well, do I just shut this app down completely? Is it just done now because it's not worth the investment to move it to something else? Or do I now lose a big chunk of this investment to move it over? Like, do I invest a bunch of time in it and lose money on it for a little while to do this move? And like, that's, if you build from the start to try to build on like boring, stable stuff, both on the server side, like just doing Linux servers, and also even in the app, like if you just use mostly like vanilla UI kit and you don't do a lot of like fancy hacks and things that might break in future OS updates, that also will help you just make sure that you can keep that going for a long time. Anyway, we are sponsored this week, as mentioned, by Linode. Linode gives you fast, powerful web hosting for your projects. You can set up in just seconds and leave running for years if you want to. Linode plans start at just $5 a month. That gets you a server with 1 gig of RAM in the Linode cloud, and you can get a lot more after that if you want to. $5 a month for a gig of RAM. To give you some idea, my first VPS was $50 a month for 128 megs of RAM. And that wasn't that long ago. So this is pretty great. Anyway, Linode has over 400,000 customers who are all serviced by their friendly 24/7 support team. You can email them, call them, or even chat over IRC in the Linode community. If you need help, Linode is there for you in whatever way you want. They have comprehensive guides and tons of support documentation to teach you everything you need to know about setting up and managing your own Linux virtual server. Their control panel is beautifully designed with a focus on ease and simplicity. You can deploy, boot, resize, and clone servers in just a few clicks. They have two-factor authentication to keep you safe, and you can also create snapshot images of your disk volumes for backup and replication. Linode is the full package for your server infrastructure needs. They have the power you need as well as the infrastructure and assistance that you want. So check it out today. You can get 1 gig of RAM for just $5 a month. You can go all the way up with lots of things in between to 16 gigs of RAM for just $60 a month. And of course, there's even higher ones after that if you want to. Their 2 gig plan now includes 30 gigs of storage, all for just $10 a month. There's tons of great options at Linode at pretty much every price point. These servers are great, and they're very powerful for the money. As a listener of this show, if you sign up at linode.com/radar, you'll not only be supporting us, but you also get $20 towards any Linode plan. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, there's nothing to lose. So go to linode.com/radar. To learn more, sign up, and take advantage of that $20 credit, or use promo code RADAR2017 at checkout. Thank you so much to Linode for supporting this show and for keeping our apps running for years into the future without much effort from us.
Yep, years and years and years. So the last thing that I think it seemed like it would be good to bookend this discussion with would also just be to say that this approach of thinking about an application as an annuity that you kind of build and then can kind of leave on its own for the most part, or do lightly maintain potentially, is probably not for everybody. And I was thinking about it a little bit. That there's two groups that I feel like this approach really wouldn't work for, and that is people who are perfectionists and people who kind of have a growth mindset, in the sense of you kind of have that vision of the venture started kind of company that's trying to be, worth $1 billion, and has that kind of runaway hockey stick magic fanciness. I don't know. Like those two groups of people I feel like would not do well with this kind of approach, because by its nature, it is optimizing for minimizing input, and rather than trying to maximize output. Which works well for me. I love that I can, sort of, once you get a business to this, you put in years, it takes years to get there, but if you put in years of work with this kind of mentality, you can get to a point where your core business requires relatively little input, and gives you a steady, reliable, slightly decaying over time, but can be bolstered periodically, by putting inputs into the system. rather than something that is growing, month after month, year after year. It's like, oh, we need to be doubling every 6 months or whatever. Like, this is not an approach or a mindset for an application that will lead to that kind of a result. And I think in our next episode, like I said at the beginning of this one, if you're looking to sell an application or have a big exit or something like that, you might structure your application and your approach differently than this. But it can work for some people, or it wouldn't work for others. And I think also if you're a perfectionist, if you're someone who just wants to keep tinkering and polishing over and over and over again and keep working on something until it's, it's almost like the asymptote that you're approaching is perfection rather than looking at it the other way around of kind of like hitting good enough and then just letting it slide on to, into the future. It's probably not for you either.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it's kind of like the culmination of everything we've been trying to teach the audience for this entire podcast.
Sure.
This entire run of the show so far is like, when you're an indie, if you want to optimize your limited resources, you have no other staff, or you have very little other staff. You don't have a huge amount of cash with VC money to like build up stuff at a large scale very quickly, up front. And so, in order to optimize your limited resources, and especially mostly your limited time, it does help to have these qualities, to really not be a perfectionist and to be willing to ship something that is good enough. And then to decide afterwards, you know what, now I that's kind of done, or at least seems to be done for a while. And now I can move on and do something else, or I can move on to feature expansion, to expand into new markets, instead of doing things like perfectly sanding down every single individual feature to be totally perfect. In a lot of ways, the whole point of the show is to tell people, like, if you want to run a business the way we do, and especially the way you do, then this is how you do it. This is like, it is possible to make a living in the App Store, but if you do it in these other ways that might be more high profile, it's harder and it's less likely to succeed. Whereas if you do it this way, where you're really just building up a whole bunch of asymptotes of gradual income from a larger quantity of apps that are not necessarily all perfect, but you can get them all to be good enough and to be long-term businesses, that is actually a way more likely approach to succeed in the App Store than hoping that you are going to be the new tank game that makes $1 million in a day.
Yeah, and I think it's the biggest adjective that comes to mind is in this approach is tolerance, and it's like it's being okay with with letting things go and being like, this is fine. I think this is good enough. And being honest with yourself about that and having that as your goal. And, I know that's not the approach that everyone feels comfortable with or will take. And I think especially the Apple developer community, at least early on, and I imagine it's certainly to some degree, has that bit of the mentality that they kind of took from Apple and the way that they build things, which is not this at all. Like, this is in no way, I think, the approach that Apple builds most of their products. That they take the other extreme of like the highly engineered, highly polished approach to something that's a premium product, and like that works. And that model, like the premium product market, works clearly. It works for Apple, it works for Tiffany's. You can think of any number of car manufacturers that take that approach, and like that works. But I think it struggles when you're a small company, when you're one person, to be viable, to be, it's like if your goal is to kind of win the lottery or to have that premium approach, so many things have to go right for you that are outside of your control. But if your goal is more modest and your goal is to say, it's like, it's much less scary to say, my goal is for an app, to make an app that makes $50 a day. Like that is much less scary than trying to make an app that I could, that makes tens of thousands of dollars a day and could potentially be purchased for millions of dollars. Like those are big, scary things. Making it much smaller, much more modest, I think is a much more approachable and reasonable thing for, small developers to take. And, I can speak from experience that over time, it works.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Tune in next week when we talk about selling your apps instead of keeping them forever. Thanks, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.